Hi, John here, the hat guy. Yes, I know I have a hat that some people would consider controversial today. It's a hat. I wore this hat because this was a hat that was worn by, or represents hats that were worn by people that fought during what is commonly known as the American Civil War. Technically, by the definition of Civil War, it was not a civil war. It was a failed war for independence for certain states. And this particular hat, because it's gray, was worn by people in the South, the Confederacy. I'm wearing this one because I had ancestors who fought for the South. I love my country, don't get me wrong. I'm a patriot. I love America, love everything about it. But I also respect my history. So don't focus on the hat. The reason I wore this was simply because of the Civil War. And I will call it the Civil War in spite of the fact that it was not. It's what's commonly known as the Civil War. Some people refer to it as Lincoln's War. Some people refer to it as the War for Southern Independence. At any rate, it's most commonly known as the Civil War. So that's what I'll refer to it as for the purposes of this little discussion today. The reason I bring up the Civil War is not to give you a history lesson, although I'm going to throw some dates at you, and mainly to make a point. My point is, and I'm going to start with my point. My point is that we are more divided in this country today than we ever have been, and I include 1860. And for those of you who are history challenged, 1860 is right before the Civil War. First of all, let's lay some groundwork down, establish some facts. The Civil War was fought because two groups of people thought differently, radically differently, and there was no middle ground. That much is fact. That's the basis for most wars. Another basis for most wars is money. Civil War was fought for financial reasons. To sum it up briefly, most of the industry was in the North, yet most of the taxes were paid by the South. The South didn't like that. The North did. War ensued. That's greatly summarized, but at any rate, you get the point. The two groups of people, now most people are going to say, well, it's blacks and whites, and African Americans versus white Americans, or Caucasians versus African Americans, or slaves versus, it's none of that. It's an idea. It had nothing to do with skin color. It had nothing to do with slavery, to be honest with you, although that was a big issue during the time. And after the war was over, that issue was settled once and for all, and thank God it did. Because I don't agree with slavery. However, at the time it was legal. And I'll give you two examples of that. The first example, the best example in my mind for why the war was not fought over slavery, is the state of West Virginia. The state of West Virginia entered the Union in 1863. The war started in 1861. The state of West Virginia entered the Union as a slaveholding state in the middle of a war that we teach our kids today was fought over slavery. Well, that doesn't make sense logically. A couple of years after the war ended, an act of Congress abolished slavery. There are two big generals. One of them's been in the news a lot in recent years, and that was Robert E. Lee. He was one of the big generals in the South. Ulysses Grant, was one of the big generals in the North. One of those men owned slaves, one of them did not. Now, if you go with what we're taught in school, that the North was all against slavery and the South was all for slavery, you would assume that Robert E. Lee was the slave owner and that Grant was not. When in fact the reverse is true. General Grant, later President Grant, owned slaves until the day an act of Congress made him free the slaves, a couple of years after the war ended. Robert E. Lee inherited some slaves from his wife's family and freed them the day he got them because he didn't believe in slavery. Things that make you question what you're taught. Not saying that schools are wrong. I'm saying that when somebody gives you some facts, go out and research it, back it up, find out what's really going on, find out if they've got a hidden agenda they're trying to shove down your throat. But my point that I want to make is that we're so different. We're more divided today, ideologically. Today it's a divide of left versus right, liberal versus conservative, Democrat versus Republican. You can call it whatever you want. It's two separate mindsets that are diametrically opposed to each other. And I'm not a young man. You can tell that by my silver beard and my silver and gray hair. I'm not all that old either. I'm in my early 50s, and I'm at an age where I can pretty easily relate to both sides of the fence. I can relate to the really old people because I am old. I can relate to the younger people because it wasn't that long ago that I was young. So I'm at an interesting age. But you've got people on one side, and age isn't really a relevant issue, but you've got people on the one side that love America and everything that it stands for. And the people my age remember when we were a great country, and that when people on both sides of this divided thought process were able to come to common ground and agree that America was a great nation and we all loved our country. We had different ideas on how to go about doing things, but we came together and we got things done. That doesn't happen today. Today, you've got one side which hangs on to those ideals from years ago, and the other side which wants to change everything into some utopia that they're dreaming of that is really the same thing that communist China, the Soviet Union, Venezuela, and Cuba have, which is misery and horrible living conditions. But ultimately, it's all about control. People on one side want to control people. The people on the other side feel that people can control themselves. It's interesting when you really start down that road. And with social media in today's world, it progresses rapidly. And that scares me because when you start looking at dates, I'd mentioned I'm going to throw some dates at you. Let's talk about the state of Texas to prove my point. What I'm talking about with how fast information travels today. Information travels today at the speed of thought, almost. As soon as you can type it into a computer, somebody else is reading it and looking at it, or speaking into a camera, someone else is seeing it and looking at it. But in the mid-1800s, that wasn't the case. Social media wasn't around. Telephones weren't even around. Electricity wasn't around for the early part of the century, for most of the century, in fact. Electricity wasn't invented until the 1880s. And I mean, it was known about, but it wasn't in use really anywhere until the 1880s. But I got some notes here because I didn't know all the dates and I didn't want to mess them up. But look at how fast the progression takes place and how fast things change in Texas. Now, January 23rd, 1691, Spain appointed the first governor of Texas. Now, that was a long time ago, granted. So, just establish the fact that Spain's in charge. Up until 1821. In 1821, Mexico declared independence from Spain. So, in 1821, let's say you were born in the early part of the 1800s, before 1821, you would remember Spain being in charge. And then now all of a sudden, Mexico's in charge. Same language, not a big difference. Not a whole lot changed. But on March 2nd of 1836, which is not that, it's 15 years later. 15 years later, without the use of a telephone or social media, the Republic of Texas was born. Different idea. Now all of a sudden we're not, bound to these other people. We're going to, take care of herself. We're our own country now. And by the way, I'm not in Texas. I'm in Florida. I'm just using Texas as an example. That was March 2nd, 1836. On December 29th of 1845, again, roughly 15 years later, Texas joins the United States of America as a slave-owning state, I might add, just prior to the war. But then again, a handful of years later, February 1st, 1861, they seceded from the Union, and a month later joined the Confederacy. And then didn't rejoin. Well, the war ended and the Confederacy ended 1865. And then it wasn't until 1870 that Texas rejoined the Union. So you could conceivably, when you look at those dates from 1821 to 1870, that would be someone my age. someone who was in their 60s at that time would remember when Spain was in charge, then Mexico was in charge, then it was the Republic of Texas, then it was the United States, then it was the Republic of Texas again for a month, then it was the Confederate States of America, then it was a territory of the United States, then it was a state again. All in that person's lifetime. And that was all done without social media. So ideas can spread rapidly, and they've always spread rapidly. But social media enhances that, and it also gives you the ability to be anonymous, unless you're like me and standing in front of a camera and giving your opinion. I've given my opinion anonymously before, and it's effective to a degree. But we really need to be careful, because when you look at history, and you look at 150 years ago, what happened in this country, remember the hat I'm wearing, I don't want to see that repeated. And it's looking like it's gonna at some point. I certainly don't welcome it, but I can see it coming. And in my opinion, we really need to be careful. We need to find a middle ground. We need to pull back and find that middle ground. And yes, I'm a little biased to the side that's on the right, because I love my country, and I'm a patriot, and I'm an American, and I remember when this country was great, and it's getting there again in spite of the fact that a significant portion of the population wants to destroy it completely. That's the only thing that makes sense with what they're doing. They want the borders to be open so that anybody can come in, and drugs can come in, and gangs can come in, and all this violence can come in. And they want to give those people free health care while taxing American citizens to pay for it. Well, it's almost as if they hate America, and they hate Americans, and they hate everything America stands for, and they want to destroy it completely by letting a horde of people come in and take over. Well, my opinion is we need to come together. And those of you on the left, if you're still watching this at this point, which granted is probably not likely, you need to move a little bit back closer to the center again so that we can start working together. I'm the Hat Guy, and that's my opinion. If you want to hear more of my opinion, hit the like button and subscribe. If you're interested in more of a theological approach to things, I've got another channel out there called Good News in Sandals. Check that out. That one is a 501c3 charity. Right now we're trying to raise some money for a bus to use as a chapel. Check that out. But I'm John. I'm the Hat Guy. And that's my opinion. Have a great day.